Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about the French way of war. Yes, there's a French way of war, and I'm going to tell you all about it. I'm going to give you a synthesis of much of what I know about the French army, much of what I've learned over the past, let's say, 15 years, talking to French army officers, reading a ton of French army doctrine, and studying closely historic and recent French army operations. Now, in the last video I made, I talked about the British way of war. This video is different in two very important ways. First, when I looked into the British way of war, I naively went about it and discovered that there's actually a whole debate on this very topic. And the debate was largely about strategy or even grand strategy. And that debate was centered around the fact that Britain is an island nation, a maritime power. And so the debate was about the appropriate use of land power and having and getting involved in land wars. Like, when was it appropriate for Great Britain to do this, and how much land power should Britain, as a maritime nation, should actually have? And with the French, of course, this is totally different. There's really no such debate because France it's not an island, it's a continental power. For most of French history, it's had land borders with enemies. And therefore, if you're going to talk about a French way of war, it's really ultimately about the French army. How does the French army fight? And how does the French army try to win wars? Then the second way in which this video is different is that in the video I did on the British way of war, I basically summarized what the experts had to say about it. In this video, well, tag I'm it. I'm actually the expert. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to summarize stuff that I've already written and published about this very topic. I'm going to divide this video into three parts. In the first part, I want to identify what I see as major themes or elements that I think are essential for understanding what I perceive to be the French way of war. In the second, I'm going to bring it together and talk about what I think are the advantages of the French way of war, the good parts about it. And then finally, in the third part, I'm going to talk about the disadvantages, the weaknesses in the French way of war, particularly the doubts that arise when we think about fighting a war that's very unlike any of the wars that the French have fought since 1945. I'm thinking really about a large war against a peer or near peer adversary, against maybe somebody like, I don't know, like Russia. While I'd love for you to watch the entire thing, I put timestamps in the description so that you can jump around from section to section, because I think everybody likes that and it just makes it a lot easier. Plus, that way you can look and you can get a sense of sort of the contents. It kind of provides like an outline to this video. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, before I begin, though, I want to talk a little bit about my sources. Most of my information comes from conversations I've had over the years with senior French officers. I'm thinking mainly of colonels and generals. And happily, they're great to talk to. I think perhaps because of the education that they get, they're good to talk to. And but also, I've read just a ton of French Army doctrine. I know one French Army general who's joked that I know French Army doctrine better than any French officer. And I also want to point to several books that I think are particularly important and particularly helpful. So the first, I've got them all piled up next to me. We've got this amazing book. This is like a textbook that the French Army uses. This is by a scholar named Hervé Coutal-Béguerie. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. Coutal-Béguerie or Couteau-Béguerie. Traité de stratégie. This book is amazing because it's kind of like this whole thing. It's like an entire graduate level course on all things related to military strategy. And as a result, he does talk a lot about the French, but you also, when he talks about non-French topics, you also get a sense of his perspective as somebody grounded in French strategy. So it's very helpful. Another book that I wish to highlight, and it's another sort of French Army textbook, is this book by General Michel Yakovlev, Tactique Théorique. Remarkable book all about strategy and tactics and doctrine, and it's phenomenal. Michel Yakovlev, now he's on television a lot as sort of like a really important French military commenter, and he's really one of the best in the business. He's a very intelligent man, and this book is exceptional. We also have, and I will be referring to books like these. These are French Army publications that I picked up here or there, Commanding and Operations, General Tactics, Tactique Générale, and then Combined Armed Maneuver. These books are great. And there are many others that I've read, so I'm not limiting, this is not where I get all my information. And then lastly, I want to tell you about this book here he was then Colonel Armel Diroux. He's now a general. In fact, General Duru is now actually the second in command of one of the British Army's divisions. So he's based up in northern England. He's a really smart guy. This book, it's called Security and International Relations in Central Africa. It's a terrible, terrible title. What this really is, it's a memoir of his time when he was serving as a battalion level commander in the Central African Republic during Operation Sangaris, which was a military operation that went from, I think, like 2013, 2016. The book is full of all sorts of really interesting insights about the French in Africa and what he was doing in Central African Republic and his thinking about strategy and doctrine and all sorts of stuff. I regret, this book is in English, so I'm going to put a link in the description to this book, and I do encourage you to read it. The hardback is very expensive, but I think you can get it as like a Kindle version for much less. The editors, I think, did a real disservice to General Duru and also to the readers and to themselves, because who's going to buy a book with this weird title and this completely nondescript, it's like a plain paper bag wrapper, like around a very nice piece of scotch, a bottle of scotch. If it had been given a better title and a sexier cover, this might have actually sold copies. Maybe it has sold a lot of copies, although I doubt it, because you just look at it and like, what on earth is this? But it's a really very good read. Okay, so let's get started. Part 1, Key Traits of the French Way of War. The first topic I'm going to bring up is modularity, because this, I think, is actually a good starting point, and it is something that will make more sense as I go on. And you're going to want to ask, why are you talking about how the French army does force generation? But there's really something to this. So the French army, like all other armies, you've got this basic structure of like division, brigade, battalion, regiment, company, etc., like everybody else. But that's not how the French army fights. The way they fight is they put together these tailored task forces. So emphasize the word tailored. They call these, the basic French maneuver unit is something that's called a Tactical Combined Arms Group, or GTIA, a Groupement Tactique Interarmes. And it is entirely modular, because what it is there's a basic structure that they work with, and then they add things to this basic structure to tailor it for a specific mission, a specific set of requirements. GTIAs, as they're referred to, they come in different flavors. There's, for instance, there's an armored GTIA, there's an infantry GTIA, there's this and then that. And the basic structure has 4 basic units. So it's a battalion level echelon that the basic textbook structure has 4 core units. So they're going to be 3 of one dominant kind. So in an infantry GTIA, it's going to be 3 infantry company-sized companies, and then a 4th something else, maybe armor. And then you add to that certain elements. There's going to be a headquarters element, of course. There will be, some artillery, some engineering, some this, some that, really just depending on what you need. And if needs require, you can add more company-sized elements to this. So you could add a 5th, a 6th, I think all the way, I believe, up to 8, at which point they consider it to be too unwieldy and they cut it in 2 and create 2 GTIAs. And it's all tailored according to the need. So also like an armored GTIA is going to have 3 armored companies and then a 4th infantry, again with the headquarters element and maybe some artillery, maybe some of this, maybe some of that. But also, part of what's interesting about them is that in practice, the company's elements are not necessarily from the same regiments or the same brigades even. They're cobbled together, different bits of pieces taken from different regiments and different brigades and different companies, and it's all kind of put together and packaged into one whole. The French also have something that's at a lower echelon than this, called the Subgroupement Tactique Interarmes, the Subgroupement Tactique Interarmes, the SGTIA, the Combined Arms Tactical Subgroup. It's got the same basic structure as the GTIA, meaning at its core, you've got 4 elements. I guess in this case, it'll be like platoons. And if it's an infantry one, then you're going to have 3 infantry platoons and then a 4th armored platoon. On an armored SGTIA, it will be 3 armored, 1 infantry, and then again, some kind of headquarters element, some sort of artillery, any sort of combat support or combat service support element. And the idea being that a GTIA can spin off SGTIAs, which are given specific missions and specific tasks, and they can be expanded or as they see fit. So then you might have several SGTIAs spun out of the same kind of GTIA. And again, all of the different component pieces that you put together could be from different brigades or different regiments. This has been described almost like Legos, whereas I know that I would buy Lego kits when I was a kid, and I'd still kind of like to do it today. But whenever I'd buy the Lego kits, and then I would assemble the thing that it's supposed to be. Maybe it's like a TIE fighter, and play with that for a bit. And then I would take it apart. And in the end, all of the bits and pieces from all these Lego kits I have end up in a box. And depending on what I want to do, I rummage through my box and I'll build something out of it. So the bricks in my thing could come from different kits, right? So the different elements in a GTIA or SGTIA could be from different bits and pieces of different regiments, different brigades, et cetera, but it's all done for the sake of the mission. It's all tailored for the mission. And it has certain advantages that please the French. So one of them is that for a combination of political and logistical reasons, and I'm going to get into the politics later on in this video, the French think it's important to limit their footprint as much as possible. And they focus, I believe it's like juste suffisance. It's like just enough of a force to get the job done. You only want as much when you're building your little thing. You only want as much as you think is necessary. And of course, you make sure you've got what you need, but still, it's just sort of you tailor it so that you can have your thing. But this idea of suffisance, of sufficiency, is something that, and again, I'll get into this a little bit more as we go on, is so the concept of sufficiency is something that I think would give American military planners a great deal of anxiety, because the French concept of what is needed, what is necessary, what is sufficient is far below what the American planners would consider to be necessary or sufficient, because they're much more interested in trying to minimize risk. Of course, they have a much larger box of bricks to play with than the French do, so they have a much more luxurious idea about how many things that you can throw into this thing that you're building. All this is related to the next aspect that I want to highlight, which is this French term subsidiarité, or I guess subsidiarity. Subsidiarité is a really interesting concept because it combines the idea of command by objective or command by intent. Auftragstaktik is the German word, and you're going to find the German word in the French military doctrine, as well as command by intent or command by objective. And also this idea of, I think the Americans sometimes refer to this as mission command, but it's the idea that you want to empower subordinate officers, so the lower echelon commanders, you want to encourage and empower them to make their own decisions about how to actually achieve the commander's intent. So the commander will say, I want you to achieve a certain objective, but I will leave up to you the challenge of figuring out how you're actually going to do that. So subsidiarité has both of these things. It's both sort of the spirit of command by intent or command by objective or Auftragstaktik, and also this idea of empowering the lower echelon commanders to make their decisions and figure out what they're going to do. So in our GTIA, the SGTIA commanders, or all of the company commanders, or all the support commanders, each will be empowered to go about fulfilling their commander's intent as they see fit. The concept of subsidiarity, I believe, reflects this French, almost romantic view of the commander. The French really cling to this idea. I mean, some of it comes, I guess, from the myth of Napoleon, but it's something they've maintained ever since. The idea of the commander, the chief, being this key ingredient to military success, because it's the commander who sizes up the situation, who figures out what they need to do, and very quickly decides, all right, this is what we're going to do, and then they execute it. The French will go on and on, particularly now with all the technology that happens. They say, like, no, the technology is great, all the stuff, but what really matters is the human commander. And the human commander is this sort of the superhuman person who, with a blink of an eye, a glance of the eye, figures out what's going on and makes this decision. And it's an art. It's not a science. It's not something that you can calculate with your algorithms. It's an art, and it's a human endeavor. So subsidiarity, I think, to a large extent, is anchored in this romantic vision that the French have of the commander and of the art of command. Now, as part of that, the French believe in endowing their commanders with certain intellectual capabilities. And this is something that you certainly see in Foch. Like a lot of what Ferdinand Foch, Marshal Foch, was doing, both when he was teaching his classes at the École de Guerre at the beginning of the 20th century, and then in his 1903 book, The Principles of War, it's all about trying to teach commanders and future commanders to quickly analyze and apply certain kind of intellectual process, maybe a way of thinking about problems and then figuring out what they need to do and then quickly doing it. So I want to take a moment and I want to cite Foch. This is from his 1903 book, The Principles of War, because I think it's really invaluable for understanding sort of how the French think about command and the way their subordinate commanders are supposed to operate, at least intellectually. So Foch writes, he says, "It is here where one must place the superior notion of the military mind," and he uses the word esprit, which is this almost impossible to translate word, because esprit is like mind, spirit, intellect. Sometimes it's even just like humor. So it is here where one must place the superior notion of the military mind, or esprit, which calls upon one's character, of course, but also, as the word says, one's intellect. Again, the word esprit. So he's using the word esprit for both intellect and mind. This connotes the idea of thinking, of reflection, and it rejects the immobility of intelligence or the absence of thought, the silence of the ranks. This, the immobility of thought, the absence of thought, the silence of the ranks, might be sufficient for troops who only have to execute, but is insufficient in any case for the subordinate commander. Foch says he must, with the means in his possession, realize the thoughts of his superior. In other words, understand what is the superior getting at. Why? It's not just what does the superior want me to do, but why does the superior want me to do this thing? And then, and to do that, and then he must, with the means in his possession, realize the thoughts of his superior. And to do that, he has to understand. He must, with the means in his possession, realize the thoughts of his superior. And to do that, he has to understand and then make the best use of his means, given the circumstances, of which he is the sole judge. More than a century later, French Army doctrine basically rephrases Foch. I'm citing, I think, one of these military books, I think either the Command and Operations or Tactique Générale. If you want, I can look up to figure out, because I have a text draft of this in which I've got everything footnoted with the page numbers and everything. But in these documents, it says that command by objective relies on an idea of maneuver. We'll talk more about that, clearly expressed by the chief, and rests on the initiative accorded to subordinates, their intellectual discipline, and their reactivity in order to attain the goal fixed by the superior echelon. The idea is for the subordinates to adapt their maneuver on the fly in response to the permanent evolution of the situation, through the judicious application of the principles of Foch. These are, of course, now it's oversimplifying, but this is Foch, liberty of action, economy of force, and the concentration of efforts. This requires rigorous intellectual discipline on the part of the subordinate. Moreover, the effectiveness of subsidiarité depends on four complementary elements. These are the idea of maneuver, the relative responsibility of the subordinates, their spirit of initiative, remember that word, and the quality of the orders. Initiative in the context of the French Army's Fochian offensive doctrine, which I think is an accurate description, is crucial, for it is virtually synonymous with liberty of action. In fact, this book, Command and Operations, then gives the following definition or discussion of liberty of action and what that means. Liberty of action generates the spirit of initiative. In effect, when the commander indicates from the outset to the subordinate the goal to attain, his major effect, effet majeur, another word, put a pin in that, we're going to get to that, but while leaving to him to define the tasks, successive or simultaneous, that he will have to execute, or the means that he will have to employ to fulfill his mission with success. This type of command preserves permanently the liberty of action of all the echelons of command. The text continues, emphasizing the subordinate's ability to re-evaluate his mission and act correctly, according to his own initiative. quote, all while remaining strictly in the direction of the effect to be obtained, indicated by the chief. Meanwhile, mission command, or command by objective, optimizes economy of force because it empowers subordinates to assess how much support they require to accomplish their mission, and subordinates also are primed to push information upward related to the evolving situation. Finally, it facilitates concentration of efforts by favoring the initiative of the subordinate. Command by objective favors the initiative of the subordinate by placing him in a favorable position to seize any opportunity. So there's a sense that one of the things this is doing is this is making everything much more efficient because all of the smaller units, the subordinate units, are empowered to act to their fullest capacity rather than just simply do the thing they're told and then to wait for more orders. The next major theme that I want to present to you is the idea of initiative. Initiative is like this holy word in French military writing. It comes up over and over and over and over again in all the big strategic writing. It's a really big deal, whether we're talking Boff or Foch or Castex or any of the contemporary ones, the Coutat-Bergerie or Yakovlev, etc. They tie it together with the concepts of maneuver and of subsidiarité and of command. And it's expected of junior officers to show initiative, provided, of course, they do so while exercising what Foch described as an active intellectual discipline. Although contemporary writers say the same thing, but they don't actually use those words. So, for example, General Michel Yakovlev, in that big textbook that I showed you, he's got an entire chapter on the subject of initiative, and he opens it with a statement. He says that victory and initiative are contiguous notions. He defines initiative in terms of fixing or defining the terms of action throughout the battle of operations. The capacity to be an initiator so as to act when there's no clear instruction or when the situation changes. Yakovlev explains it further. He says, at an initiative at its most basic means, I do what I want and the enemy does what I want. What matters is that one leads the game, such that, for example, one determines the sequence of events or decides the next move, while the enemy is reduced to reacting instead of deciding the sequence of his actions. Another way to put it is that having the initiative means having options. To seize the initiative means taking away from the adversary at least one option. Losing the initiative means having some options closed off. Yakovlev connects this idea of closing off options with by referring to Clausewitz. Clausewitz, Yakovlev reminds us, defined victory as imposing one's will on the adversary. He continues. I'm going to cite this at length because I find this super interesting. Yakovlev writes that imposing one's will is a synonym for closing to him any option other than bending to our will. In other words, defeat is the total loss of options, other than submitting, of course. This does not mean that victory is an infinity of options, but victory consists of enjoying at least two options. Failure, defeat, means you don't have any options. Yakovlev insists that he wants his readers, who I believe his readers, his intended audience, are up-and-coming officers, to understand that seizing and holding the initiative must be the first objective of the military leader, and the object of any tactical reflection. The commander, he writes, and he writes this in bold print in his book, fights to win, which really means that the commander fights to seize the initiative, if he does not already have it, and to exploit it or profit from it once he has it. One can hear in Yakovlev's words echoes of Foch, who wrote, of all mistakes, one alone is infamous in action. And it's also not surprising that French doctrine from Foch to Yakovlev, or perhaps I should say from Napoleon to Yakovlev, places particular emphasis on the offensive, because it's when you're on the offensive that you are taking the initiative. When you're on the defensive, you're basically submitting to the initiative of the attacker. So thus he says, when in doubt, attack. And this brings to mind this famous line that Foch apparently wrote to his commander, who I think at the time was Joffre, in the First Battle of the Marne in 1914, where Foch writes, my center is giving way, my right is retreating, situation excellent, I'm attacking. When I read this, it reminds me of in those Mad Max movies where, the war boys spray paint themselves with a silver spray paint, and then they say, witness me, like I'm going to go and do something crazy and epic. And that's kind of the spirit that we see here. The next one I'm going to talk about that's of great importance is audacity. The first time I saw the word audacity in French military writing, I thought that it was just like, one of the writers was taking poetic license. But then I discovered, the more I read, that no, actually, this is a really big deal, this word. And it's not an accident that I find the word audacity time after time after time in French military writing of all kinds. Of course, in French, it's audace, or l'audacité, or audacieux. So the inspiration arguably comes from Napoleon, who famously said, audacity, audacity, always audacity. Foch, of course, would not have disagreed. The army that perhaps would have disagreed is the French army of the interwar years, the French army in the 1920s, 1930s, which is the French army that lost the war in 1940. And as a result, it's not an accident that the commanders who survived that, who coalesced in North Africa to form what became the Free French Army, which really became then the French Army after 1945. I'm talking about men like Leclerc and de la Tétassigny, Boff, that they very self-consciously, because they were aware of the failures of the interwar army, 1940, very painfully aware, they reached around the interwar years in search of earlier historical models. So they sort of reached around the interwar years to Foch, and via Foch back to Napoleon, in order to reaffirm this idea about audacity, offensive maneuver. Just to give you some examples of this, to illustrate this, General André Boff, who is my favorite French strategist, who wrote this amazing book. This is Introduction to Strategy. This exists somewhere in English in PDF form, and I really need to try to find it because this is the single best book of military strategy that I have ever read. If you were to read one book of military strategy, I would urge you to read this book. It's fabulous. But anyways, Boff wrote some very good memoirs about World War II. And in his discussion of the French Army's campaigns of 1944 and 1945, so this is when the French army is fighting they fought North Africa, and then Italy, and then France, and then in Germany. And there the French army fought a rapid war of maneuver that was really limited only by its dependence on American support. So there was a constant negotiation between the Free French Army and the Americans, who are the providers of, frankly, their means to do anything in terms of arms, equipment, food, ammunition, that kind of thing. Now, the example that I noticed in Boff's writing that I thought was really relevant here was that he's talking about after the Free French 1st Division landed in southern France as part of Operation Dragoon. So this is the landing in France that occurred a month or two after D-Day. The commander, General Jean de la Tétassigny, had to choose between waiting for reinforcements or before attempting to take Toulon, or just striking immediately. And according to Boff, General de la Tétassigny hesitated a little and chose audacity. And as it turned out, according to Boff, fortune smiled on the audacious. And de la Tétassigny, emboldened by his success, decided to push his luck and to move quickly against Marseille even before the Toulon operation was over. These were furious fights, but Boff, looking back, was able to trumpet the French army's return, signal not just by its victories, yay, the French army is now kicking German ass, but also by the manner in which de la Tétassigny had conducted his campaign. So now I'm citing Boff. He says, this brilliant victory in Provence carried the mark of an incontestably French style. It confirmed the full rebirth of our army after the mortal torpor of 1940. Compared to the stilted plans of our allies, he means the Americans, powerful, but without tactical spirit, our maneuvers showed what one could attain with reasoned audacity and vigor and execution. And then elsewhere, actually earlier in his memoir, he described a clash between General Henri Géraud and General Eisenhower. Apparently, Géraud was very aggressive and he wanted to go on the offensive in Tunisia, and Eisenhower was like, we're not ready yet. And he said that, Boff said that Eisenhower, of course, was reluctant. He said that Géraud, quote, thought operationally with remarkable instincts and audacity, while Eisenhower reasoned like a logistician, right? Which for a French general like Boff, this is like a backhanded compliment to, reasoning like a logistician has its advantages, but ultimately what's called for is, speed, audacity, taking the initiative. Contemporary French doctrine makes very clear that audacity is a primary virtue, though, of course, it makes great pains to say that, this doesn't mean do something stupid. So it doesn't endorse rashness. And so, for example, the 2014 edition of Tactique Générale, which might be this one that I have, I don't remember which year this is, in its discussion of liberty of action and the criticality of seizing and maintaining the initiative, insists that, quote, conserving the initiative cannot be conceived of without the leader demonstrating audacity. This is important for maintaining the moral advantage of the enemy. It is characterized by a reasonable taking of risks that enables one to impose one's actions on the adversary. Similarly, there's another French Army doctrine publication called FT04 from 2011, called The Fundamentals of Maneuver, that said that audacity was the means to enable one to transform constraint into an advantage. You've got to take risks in order to improve a difficult situation. And then elsewhere in French doctrine, we read that it is audacity encouraged by subsidiarity, that makes it possible to seize opportunities. So audacity is something that needs to be extended, encouraged by commanders at all levels, and it's by this idea that it's the ability of lower-ranking officers, lower-ranking commanders, subordinate commanders, to demonstrate audacity. That's what enables them to take the initiative and to seize opportunities. Next, we get to the idea of maneuver. Now, French theories related to maneuver are grounded in a distinction that the French draw between direct and an indirect approach. This should sound familiar to readers of the British strategist Basil Littell, and part of this is because André Boff was a friend and correspondent of Littell, and Boff really sort of brought a lot of Hart's ideas into play in France. But I don't think it would have worked if Basil Littell-Hart's ideas about the indirect approach didn't already resonate with French military thinking. Now, the definitions offered by things like Tactique Générale present something of a caricature, but basically what's interesting is that the French associate the direct approach with mass and with shock and with thinking about conflict as a confrontation of power. And in that kind of conflict, success is obtained by the cumulative effect of the power of material destruction. So you attack directly and you destroy. And this works when the enemy is conceived of in quantitative terms as a sum of forces, of capabilities that can be worn away through attrition. It's the way the French think about it. So Tactique Générale finally says that this works. First of all, it's commensurate with a very centralized command, as opposed to the French style of subsidiarité, command by intent. But the French don't really like that. So, the French prefer indirect approach, which they speak of in terms of a global maneuver. And so, again, it's the contrast between the sort of the frontal approach, the mass approach, versus seeking not to destroy the enemy, but rather to provoke its collapse. And the idea is to target a vulnerability and to thereby set in motion a chain of effects that produces the adversary's failure. The vulnerability could be something that avails itself to direct attacks, attack the thing and destroy the thing. But it could also be diplomatic, economic, logistical, political, psychological. It could be all sorts of things. Anything that limits the enemy's liberty of action. Now, according to Tactique Générale, the enemy, in light of the direct approach, is conceived of as a system that's fed by nerves, it's irrigated, it's led, and it presents strong points but also vulnerabilities. The target, therefore, is not any of the things that compose the system, but rather the coherence of the system. So this vision favors the economy of means, and it leaves a larger place for decentralization and initiative that are, according to French doctrine, I'm citing French doctrine, indispensable for the rapid exploitation of directed vulnerabilities. In the writing of Hervé Coutal-Bégarry, in his Traité de Stratégie, he extends the discussion about sort of the indirect approach versus the direct approach, and the idea that the direct approach equals shock. And he says that shock in the shock warfare, you aim to disorganize or destroy the adversary through the putting to work a mass that will act with the greatest violence. This is very effective. This can be very effective. But according to Coutal-Bergerie, it requires an abundance of resources, given the fact that obtaining shock requires having a lot more stuff than your enemy, at least at that given place and given time, in order to ensure that you succeed enough, that you accomplish enough to have made the whole thing worthwhile. A better option for Coutal-Bergerie, or perhaps a more realistic option when you don't have that kind of wealth of stuff, is maneuver, which he defines as the antithesis of shock. And it's also the antidote for the adversary's use of shock. He says that instead of overwhelming the enemy in a frontal assault, maneuver aims to act on his weak points, to outflank, encircle, cut off from its supply bases, in short, to enemy or disassociate it to such a degree that it loses its combat capacity. Or more simply, according to Admiral Raoul Castex, whom Coutal-Bergerie cites, maneuver means moving intelligently to create a favorable situation. And that's kind of really it. Now that leads us then to discussion of the French concept of the effet majeur, or the major effect. Okay, so effet majeur, it does translate literally as the major effect, but I don't think that's very helpful at all. And it's almost kind of deceiving, because major effect makes you think immediately of like the big thing, like the big ticket thing. You're going to really make something explode or something. I don't know, but it's like, but as you'll see, it's almost the opposite of that, because you're looking for sort of the minor effect, but that minor effect that will actually determine all the rest. So it's hugely important in French military writing, the effet majeur. It comes up time and time and time again. I've read lots of definitions. The definitions vary, and it's used in different ways, in different contexts, etc. So as a result, a lot of the definitions, like, they're kind of partially useful, like they're helpful, but they don't really do it justice. So many of the definitions describe the effet majeur in terms of doing the thing that guarantees victory. So if I do X, we will win the war, right? So what is X? Then you got to think about what is X. Yakovlev, General Yakovlev, adds a bit more precision, saying that it's doing the thing that allows one to seize a part of the initiative or break that of one's enemy. Okay, so you do the thing that gives you the initiative. And once you have the initiative, then all these other things are supposed to sort of follow, and this is what leads to victory. That's kind of the Yakovlevian understanding of how this works. The thing that really intrigues me, though, is Michel Goya's definition. And this came up when I actually put out on Twitter, hey, French military people, give me your best definition of the effet majeur. And lots of people give me a lot of decent answers. Some of them are really kind of off the mark because, again, the term is used in different ways in different contexts. But Goya's response on Twitter, I thought, really nailed it. He said, it is, quote, the minimum one can do to be certain of fulfilling the mission, unquote. I think this is profoundly French. So let me try to explain this. It's the minimum you can do. It's that thing you can do that will get you what you want to do. But the minimum, like, you're not aiming for pie in the sky. It's not, I'm going to destroy the enemy. That's great. Thank you very much. But I'm going to do this thing, which is going to enable me to take the initiative, which is going to enable me to do this, it's going to enable me to do that, and it's going to mess with the enemy, such that once I do that initial thing, sort of there's this cascading effect that ultimately yields to victory. The French will compare this concept with what they see as the American understanding of the Schwerpunkt, of the center of gravity. And they say that the Clausewitzian idea of the center of gravity encourages one, after first identifying what is the center of gravity, to go and attack that center of gravity. Now, the problem with that, according to the French, is that the enemy center of gravity is often where it's strongest, which is okay if you're into direct approaches and if you've got the means to attempt to pull that off. But often it's unrealistic and just foolish. So you can't afford that. And what if you can't afford that? And you have to go for an indirect approach. So what is then that one thing that you can do that will set in motion a chain of events that will enable one to achieve the mission? Now, the thing to do, according to Yakovlev, is to focus not on the first order effect, but on the second order effect. So the example is, I attack a unit. I destroy the unit. That's the first order effect. But that's not what matters. I mean, great, you destroyed the unit. What matters is that if by attacking and destroying that unit you have disrupted the enemy's plan, that's the thing that makes the difference, because you've taken the initiative, you've denied the initiative to your enemy, you've limited the enemy's options, and now you're in a position to continue to dictate things, and this is how you defeat the enemy. That's what leads to defeat. So the dislocating of the enemy's plan is far more important than destroying the combat power of any specific enemy unit. The example that Yakovlev gives is of when the Germans launched an offensive in 1940 into the Ardennes forest. The Germans, by crossing into the Ardennes, they destroyed some defending French units. Doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter that the French army, which was vastly larger and superior to the German army, that it was still intact, because most of the French army was to the north of the Ardennes, it was in Belgium and the Netherlands, and it was fine. So, but it's not the destruction of the units, the combat power of the units that were defending Sedan. It was the fact that the German thrust through Sedan, disrupted French plans, and from that point onward, the French were never able to regain the initiative. That's what doomed the French army, not the destruction of the units that happened to find themselves on the path of the German army when they attacked the offensive at Sedan. So that's sort of an example. It's doing that thing that messes with the enemy, but it messes with their plans, and it denies them the initiative. And it's the thing that, where either way, it's that one thing that you can do that is going to ensure success. I'm going to say more about this a little bit later when I talk about the advantages of the French way of war, because I think it's a super interesting concept. In talking, though, about the Schwerpunkt versus the Effet Majeur, one finds in French writing a frequent reflection on the differences between the French way of war and the American way of war. Now, I did discuss this at length in the video that I made about the American way of war, so I don't want to repeat all of that here in this video. But the Americans are an important foil. And one of the ways that the French think about this is that the French see the Americans as favoring shock and mass. And they've described, I cited this one French scholar who cites a French general who says that American military operations really amount to a huge demolition project. And it's also, the Americans are obsessed with planning, and the French see the Americans as being sort of the uber Jominian. It's this Jominian approach to warfare, but almost a caricature of Jomini. And they talk about Jomini in terms of describing the national place where you can control what happens. So through careful planning and an almost scientific approach to war, you can reduce risk to almost zero and guarantee success, or virtually guarantee success. And I think about this anytime I read American military doctrine talking about overmatch. Like the American military has this fantasy about having overmatch. And overmatch means that winning a battle is a foregone conclusion because you've overmatched. It's the outcome is guaranteed, right? I've never seen the French talk about this. The French do not aspire for overmatch, and I don't think they think it's realistic. They're not interested in overmatch. It's not an aspiration that they have. It's not a fantasy that they indulge. Rather, to get back to the Americans, one of the things that happens, though, and this is both good and bad, is that, it speaks to the strength and the weakness of the French, but the French kind of consequently, the French army has this very weird way of romanticizing glorious defeats. Classic example, the French Foreign Legion to this day celebrates the Battle of Cameroon in Mexico, which was in the 1860s, I don't remember when. It's this battle in which some unit of the Foreign Legion was destroyed, but they fought gloriously to the last man, and it's something that they still celebrate. They do these weird ceremonies with these leather aprons and beards and hatchets, and I don't understand any of it, but that's what they do. But it's really weird because it was a horrible defeat. And let's not even get into what on earth were they doing in Mexico in the first place, because that was one of the dumbest wars the French have ever gotten themselves involved with. French Marines similarly celebrate their defeat by the Bavarians in 1870 at the Battle of Bazaille. And then, of course, there's the mother of all French defeats, which is Dien, and the entire Indo-Chinese epic, which is this whole defeat, but it's something that the French really romanticize, because they romanticize sort of the valor and the audacity and the fact that there are all these examples time and time again of French units and French commanders doing these completely batshit crazy things, but they're like, this is audacity, and this is really great. If you want proof of this, of the sort of the French army view of Dien Bien Phu, they know that this was a disaster. They know that the whole thing was a mistake. So, they get it rationally. The head gets it, but the heart's in this other place. If you want proof, check out Pierre Schoendorfer's 1992 film, Dien, It's a beautiful, beautiful movie shot there at Dien. Schindler, by the way, was a cameraman who was at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, so he's a survivor, and so he was able to recapture visually, I guess, what he remembered from the actual battle. It's a beautiful movie. Now, watch the movie, and then your second task is try finding a senior French officer who has not seen the movie, because as far as I know, they've all seen the movie, plus they've read all of Schindler's books and his movies and whatever. So anyways, according to the French, for the Americans, Cameroon, Béziers, Dien Bien Phu, these are all monstrous planning failures. These are things that you don't do because you never get in, you put yourself into these situations. And the idea, the American approach is to plan. And also the Americans related to this in the French thinking is this belief that you marshal enough force, enough effects, you win this big decisive battle. And they think that the Americans are totally wedded to this idea of decision in battle. You have the big battle, decisive battle, and then you destroy the enemy. This is great in a conventional setting, but most modern wars are actually not conventional, and they're asymmetrical, and they're limited wars fought for limited political objectives, and in which case this sort of demolitions project that the Americans conduct, in French, according to the French, is really inappropriate. This doesn't lead to victory. And they say that this is why the Americans keep losing these wars, because we bring to these limited wars a mentality that's appropriate for an unlimited war, a total war. It's as if when Americans read Clausewitz, they only read the bits, particularly in the beginning of Clausewitz's book, that talk about basically total war. And he talks about how there's like a flight to the extremes. And that's the part the Americans focused, according to the French. Whereas there's all this other stuff in Clausewitz, particularly later in the book, where Clausewitz talks about limited wars for limited objectives, which require limited means, etc. So modern warfare, limited warfare, requires nuance. And this American planning mentality and this idea of throwing massive amounts of resources into a thing in the search of a decisive battle is completely missing the boat. One consequence of this is, and then sort of the last thing that I'm going to bring up in terms of a theme is what I see as a de-emphasis on firepower. It's almost as if the French dismiss it. They have disdain for it. It's just sort of like badges. I don't need no stinking badges. Like, I don't need this. And I read, for example, that during the Cold War, French tanks had the least amount of protection than any of the main battle tanks then being used by Western armies, because the French basically were banking on speed and maneuverability to be more valuable than protection in keeping their tankers alive and enabling the tankers to do the things that the tanks need to do. So even today, if you look at the French army, while they have excellent howitzers, these 155 millimeters, these are howitzers, they really don't have many of them. They also have MLRS, but really very few. It's almost like an afterthought, and it's almost like it's beneath them. When I did a study for the RAND Corporation on Operation Serval, and I was really struck by the fact that the French army brought 4 Caesar howitzers with them to Mali for Operation Serval in 2013. And so I asked the French people who were involved in Serval, I said, why only 4, right? If you've got, I think at the time the French might have had 90 or something, why not 10, 20, 30? Why only 4? And I was told that that's as much as they could get out of their commanders. So the commanders of Paris say, like, hey, send us heavy artillery. And the commanders, who, by the way, were from a light infantry expeditionary background, like, what do you need firepower for? Like, what do you need that for in Mali? So, okay, well, we'll give you 4, right? That's all they got. And then in the field, like, all right, 4, we'll make do. Now, it turns out that was actually consequential. It was taking a risk because, from what I understand, 4 Caesar howitzers, as amazing as Caesar howitzers are, they can only be in one place at one time, or 2 at one time. But, they can't be everywhere. And Mali's a gigantic country. And if you're serious about providing fire support for some operation that you're doing, you want to make sure that your howitzers are available just in case, or as part of the plan. But because they only had 4, this meant that the French in Mali had to plan operations sequentially rather than simultaneously, because they don't want to be in a situation where they need to be able to provide the fire support at more than one place at a time. Now, for one thing, this is risky, because maybe you're doing an operation here, you're using your howitzers here, but you're attacked over there. But you need the fire support, but you don't have it. So it's risky. The other thing is that doing things sequentially rather than simultaneously is not a best practice. The French army believes, and I believe other armies would agree with this, that it's best if you're attacking the enemy, you do multiple things simultaneously. This is a great way to grab the initiative and to keep the initiative and to keep the enemy on the back foot, rather than sequentially, because sequentially then you give them an opportunity to sort of collect themselves and organize themselves. So at the very least, it's not a best practice, but also there's some real risk involved. Now, okay, so part two, let's talk about the advantages of the French way of war. One clear advantage is that it favors flexibility, and it is very efficient with respect to dosage. The French, thanks to the GTIA and the SGTIA and their entire approach to how they do things, are able to dole out military force sort of by the teaspoonful. They're just like, a little bit here, a little bit here. Or perhaps another way of thinking about it is that it's like, imagine if you want to buy a Snickers bar, but you only have a $100 bill. And you go into, 7-Eleven and buy the Snickers bar, but you're like, I don't know if I want to break my $100 bill. And maybe the cashier is going to refuse to break the $100 bill because you don't have enough change, and you just don't want to do this. So maybe the best thing is just not to get the Snickers bar. Whereas the French, instead of having the $100 bill, they've got like a fistful of $5 bills. So they're like, all right, if I want a Snickers bar, I'll get me a Snickers bar, because they can tailor it. They can dose it. And it's very efficient, particularly when you have a smaller army, that you can be able to dose it out in small bits so that you can conserve as much of the rest as you possibly can. And also because you're not breaking apart large units and you're preserving everything. It's a much better, much more efficient use of the resources that they actually have. This is about tailoring your force for a specific purpose. And it also bespeaks this idea of sufficiency. You look at the mission, you figure out, well, what do I need to do to accomplish this mission? And you provide exactly that. And this is great, particularly for expeditionary armies. And this is part of why I think the French army is one of the very best armies in the world when it comes to expeditionary operations. This ability to dose out military power in these small denominations, which is great given their limited logistical capabilities, etc. So it's very powerful. Also, favoring efficiency, this idea with subsidiarité that they're empowering the smaller units to act to their fullest capabilities. You're empowering lower echelon commanders also to take the initiative and really to make the most of the resources that they have. And all of this, I think, is really very well suited for a smaller military that lacks means. And the French indeed pride themselves on being able to make do with what they've got. I also want to argue that the French way of warfare promotes modesty with respect to what they believe the military can actually accomplish. All armies talk about the subordination of military strategy to politics, right? This is Clausewitz, basic Clausewitz. If you take anything away from Clausewitz, it should be that idea. I think the French take it more to heart than Americans do. For one thing, because we've learned that this is how the French, part of the lessons that the French take from the Suez War or from Algeria. And if you read Boff, who was the commander in the Suez and he was involved in Algeria, this is what they say over and over and over again. You've got to be subordinate to politics. It's absolutely essential. Now, if your military strategy is supposed to be subordinate to your political goals, then remember that in most wars, your political objectives are limited. So this isn't total war. It's not that we're going to destroy Nazi Germany. We have a limited objective. We are going to align limited means against the limited objective, which means we have to think very differently about, well, what can we actually accomplish? We can't throw everything but the kitchen sink at achieving some limited military objective in support of this limited political objective. So we have to reduce our ambition and think about, well, what's the thing we can achieve? What can the military do that will contribute to the attainment of the limited political objective? And that's where we get back to the concept of the Effet Majeur, this idea it's the minimal thing you can do in order to achieve your mission. So it's a different outlook. It's a different way of thinking about it. Um, Years ago, I spoke, well, when I was doing research on Operation Serval, I got to meet with a French Army colonel. He's probably a general now. I've lost track of him, who was one of the people involved in planning Operation Serval. And he told me about how he saw a difference between the French way of planning operations and the American way of planning operations. And he said that with the Americans, you having identified what is the thing you want to do, because the American military has such vast resources, you can really aim high. It's go big or go home. It's this sort of you can imagine whatever it is, the optimal solution to fix a problem you can do. You can just go crazy and do whatever you want. But having the almost unlimited means encourages having ambitious objectives. So being able to think pie in the sky, to do aim for the maximum objective, encourages you to have higher objectives, to be more ambitious in what you set out to do in the first place. And he said with the French, it's the other way around, that because they're so conscious of having limited means, they're really thinking in terms of minimal effect. What is the minimum we can do to achieve this limited thing than we can possibly do, right? So it's more pragmatic, it's more modest. And as somebody who lived through the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan, and I think about how bonkers it was that the U.S. military, I think because of this sort of the vastness of our resources, how we encouraged ourselves to think pie in the sky about the kinds of objectives, the things that we were going to achieve in Iraq and Afghanistan. Whereas in reality, even with all of our military wealth and largesse capabilities, our military can only accomplish so much. And thus our military could not actually bring about the overly ambitious political objectives that we had set for themselves. And I think that the French approach spares them to some extent from getting into that kind of trouble. I mean, we could talk about Mali, maybe that's an exception, whatever. That's another conversation. This brings us to part 3, the disadvantages of the French way of war. So I think a clear disadvantage of the French way of war is that the French way of war has made them extraordinarily talented in the art of cutting things close. They really cut things close. So, the American army has a belt and suspenders approach to things. They'll wear a belt and suspenders. Now, you don't need both to keep your pants up. Whereas the American army is like, no, we're going to take both because guess what? We can afford both. And we don't want to take the risk because maybe either the belt or the suspenders will fail, God forbid. So we're going to wear both. And maybe we're going to have spare sets in our baggage that we're going to take with us. Whereas the French are like, well, I don't have a belt and I don't have suspenders, but I've got a string I can tie around my pants. I'll keep them up. We're good to go. So let's go. Let's attack. But there's risk involved, right? I mentioned the 4 howitzers in Mali. But, another example, I spoke with he was then a colonel who was in charge of logistics for Operation Serval, and he told me about water and everything that the French army had to do in order to ensure that the troops had adequate quantities of water when they're fighting in Mali. Mali, remember, is an extraordinarily hot place. It's often 50 degrees Celsius in the areas where the troops are fighting. That's 120 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, it's really awful. And the probability of dying from the heat is probably greater than dying because of any act of violence on the part of the adversary. So getting water to the troops is a vital necessity. But the French, because of the limited logistical capabilities and because of the geographic dispersion, et cetera, only just barely managed to get this done. And this colonel even told me the story about how they would put pallets of bottled water on these trucks that in containers, and the trucks would be able to go to a certain distance. But then at some point they had to open up the containers and break apart the pallets of bottled water and put the water on smaller trucks, like pickups or something, that could then take the water the rest of the way to the troops. But this is a real problem because you can only stock the water so high because we're not talking about roads. We're talking 4x4s. You're off-roading, and so stuff gets jostled, it falls off the back of the truck. So what do you do? Because you're not going to get enough water to the troops. They're going to die. So the French, I don't know if they're officers or NCOs or whoever was in charge of this, they're unpacking, they're loading the water up on the smaller trucks. They figure out, oh, here's a solution. They take the wood from the pallets that the bottled water was in, and they built kind of cages around the back of the smaller trucks that would enable them to put greater quantities of the bottled water in the back of the trucks, thereby enabling them to get more or get enough water to the troops in the field. So they pulled it off, but that's like they're cutting it close. Like that's really dangerous. And then you look at examples, of plenty of examples where in Sangaris, in this wonderful memoir by Diarou, I believe that at least 2 instances he describes his troops could have been overrun and killed. Why? Because the French forces in Central African Republic were dosed out in such small quantities, and they were so dispersed geographically that they couldn't help each other, and they didn't have much fire support, and it would have been very easy for them to be wiped out. It never happened, partly because they were lucky, partly because they were good, but still they're taking a chance. And they're always kind of counting on this, the idea that, they're going to be lucky, but they're also very good. And so they'll take the risk, but it's dangerous. And, the number of examples I can think of French military operations where they're doing something batshit crazy that could get them all killed. And more often than not, they survive. They're fine, but then not always. Like sometimes they're not. It doesn't really work out. Conventional war, though, and this is where we get to conventional war in Ukraine, you can't get away with that kind of thing. Conventional war requires more planning, requires being more careful, requires less risk-taking, requires enormous quantities of things. It's not just some shells. You need a lot of shells, and that's just 4 howitzers. You need lots of howitzers. You need lots of everything, and this is a major effort. And so there's a real question of, like, how does this actually work? How would the French fare against the Russians? Yes, they can plan. They're capable of it, obviously, but their forte, the way they operate, it's almost as if they're almost like anti-planners. They're almost about like relishing the idea of kind of going without. But they can't get away with it when you're fighting somebody like the Russians, so they have to adapt. Hopefully they can, if God forbid such a eventuality were to take place. But let's then think about it, though. What happens if, let's say, some large French units go toe-to-toe against some large Russian units? Now, the French theory is that the Russian firepower won't be able to pin them down, and that what the French believe that they will be able to do is that they're going to be able to fight the Russians like a young Cassius Clay. They're going to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, and they're going to dance around the Russians and completely cut them to pieces. If that's true, and I think it's likely, they would cut the Russians to pieces, but only for a little while, because not too long after, maybe within the first week, they'll run out of ammunition. And then they're in big trouble. Because the Russians don't fight like Cassius Clay. The Russians fight like the old Muhammad Ali. It's rope-a-dope, right? You take the beating, take the beating, and take the beating, and then when you can, like wham, you do the big killing blow. That's how they operate. And they have the firepower, which then raises the question, like maybe the French are wrong, that while they're trying to float like a butterfly, the Russians are going to be able to take their big artillery hammer and smash the butterfly, and that's the end of that. Who knows? And I really hope that we never find out. So if you like this video, by the way, please like and subscribe. I'm very grateful, and it helps support the channel. And also in the description, I've also put links to various works that you can read, as well as General Diarou's book. And then for the French readers, I put links to the French stuff that I talked about, although I'm willing to bet that most of you are already familiar with Koutab Begari and Yakovlev, and you already know this stuff. But anyways, I'm going to put it on there. Plus, I've got links to my Twitter and my Blue Sky and my LinkedIn, and then my own website, michaelshirkin.com, and then also my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. Anyway, stay tuned. There's plenty of stuff in the pipeline, and thank you very much.